fellow birders, my name is Dennis Kania. Today we're going to be taking a look at yellow-billed and black-billed cuckoos. On the DuPage Birding Club education channel, we'll be discussing all things bird related. And as I mentioned, today we'll be talking about yellow-billed cuckoos and black-billed cuckoos. So here are two cuckoo candidates in DuPage County. And the one on the left here is yellow-billed cuckoo, and then on the right we have black-billed cuckoo. And you can see that they certainly do share a lot of similar characteristics in structure and in colors. They're long-tailed birds, very plain brownish gray on the back in both cases. And just because of lighting, this one maybe looks a little browner, but there's really no difference in color between the two birds. On the upper parts, the under parts are going to be very whitish, and they do share the similar bill structure. You can see that there's really a considerable curvature to the culmen on this bill here. It's very obvious. It turns out yellow-billed cuckoos are somewhat heavier billed than black-billed cuckoos, but the structure is about the same as far as the curvature. So they're very similar looking birds. And quite often they're heard much more often than seen. When they are calling, they usually bury themselves up in leaves someplace, and it's very hard to detect where they're calling from. We're more likely to see them when they're actually on the move. And at that point in time, they're probably not doing a lot of calling. So then we have that problem of trying to ID them without song. So let's take a look for starters with the yellow-billed cuckoo. And there are some key features that we can look at when we do get a good look at these birds, when they do decide to make an appearance. The yellow-billed is going to have, of course, a yellow lower mandible, and you can see that in this close-up here. It's very yellow. Some of the yellow can even end up in the upper mandible as well. And they will have a yellow orbital ring, and here's the ring around the eye. You can see in this particular example, it's very yellowish. And this is actually skin, so that's why we call it an orbital ring. It's not an eye ring, which would be caused by feathers. So this is actually skin in this case, and it is yellow in the case of yellow-billed cuckoos generally. Another feature that we can look for would be the rufous edges in their flight feathers, and you can see a close-up of that here. You can see there really is a lot of rufus. If you see the total wing, as we can see here, you can see there is some contrast between that very rufusy area and then the plain brown of the rest of the wing. So you would look for that as well. And another characteristic that you can take a look for is bold white spots on the underside of the tail. And so in this close-up, it's quite obvious. You can see these big white spots. And in the case of both of our cuckoos, they have a graduated tail. And so the central tail feathers are the longest. And as we go to each pair of feathers, working our way out towards the outer edge of the tail, each set gets shorter and shorter. And so what that allows to happen is that you're going to see the tips of every pair of those feathers. And in the case of a yellow-billed cuckoo, you have a very big white spot on the end of each tail feather. So that causes you to be able to see a series of white spots running up the tail. In the overall picture here, you can see how that pattern appears. But it's very obvious, and it's something that's easily seen even when the birds are in flight. So here's our black-billed cuckoo. You can see, again, structurally very much the same. We're looking at close-ups again, and in the case of the black-billed cuckoo, we do in fact see that it has a black bill. And we can see that the orbital ring is red in this case, as opposed to what we were seeing before in the yellow-billed cuckoo. When we look at the flight feathers, we can see that it's lacking those rufous edges that we saw in the yellow-billed cuckoo. So it just is pretty much brown all the way through and matches the rest of the wing, which we can see in the overall picture here. So you're not getting that contrast that you get with the rufus in the yellow-billed cuckoo. And if we look at the underside of the tail, you can see that instead of having these very bold white spots on each tip of each tail feather, we now have just these like little white crescents. And they're actually bordered by a little bit of a dark gray area above them as well. So it's quite a different pattern than what we see in that yellow-billed cuckoo. And if you didn't quite understand what I was saying about the graduated tail feathers before, it's quite obvious in this picture. You can see the central tail feathers are the longest, and as we go outward on each then pair of tail feathers, you can see that each one is just a little bit shorter, shorter, until you get to the outermost tail feather, which is this one here, and this one here, and you can see those are by far the shortest tail feathers and those are the outer ones. So you, in the case of that yellow-billed cuckoo, you would see those really big bold spots here on several places. And in this case, you see these white crescents instead. So all that seems simple enough, but we have to be prepared for some variability in some of those features because there is a fair amount of variability in these birds. They don't always stick to the rules that we've just outlined. So in the case of the yellow-billed cuckoo, you can see that the orbital ring is not always yellow. So in this case, you can see it's kind of just a grayish color. You can see that certainly the lower mandible is yellow, and that yellow is even extending up into the upper bill as well. So it's quite extensive as far as the yellow in this area, but we're totally lacking that yellow eye ring here, or orbital ring. The rufus in the flight feathers, depending on the lighting or the position of the bird or how closed the wing is, it may be difficult to catch that rufus. And if you kind of use your imagination a little bit, you can see that there is a slight amount of rufus in this area here. And if the bird were in flight, it would probably be more obvious. But in this case here, where the bird is at rest, it's very difficult to see the rufus in this area. So we have to be aware of the fact that that rufus may not always show up and provide a clue. We do, on occasion, have yellow-billed cuckoos that are juveniles, and those might not show yellow in the bill at all. It might just be pale here in the lower mandible at the base. So we have to be aware of that. So your best chance for IDing these birds with reliability is to see the underside of that tail. And quite often you'll end up in a situation like this where you can't see that part of the bird. So you have to hope that the bird turns around, or if it takes off, you can actually catch that feature in flight. So you have to kind of look for that. Just as the yellow-billed cuckoo had some features that are not 100% reliable, you have the same thing going on with black-billed cuckoo as well. In this case, we're lacking that red orbital ring. In fact, it almost looks yellowish here, so that could be quite deceiving. But the bill is black, as we would expect it to be. Those brown flight feathers that we expect to see, that's quite obvious in this image here. But as we talked about with the yellow-billed cuckoo, they're not always obvious. So you're going to have to look very closely at this area to decide if there's any rufus there or not. So it's a feature that we can utilize, but it does require a very, very close look. And so you should be aware of that. So some juvenile black-billed cuckoos might show a pale lower mandible. This individual is not, but I do see individuals sometimes where the base of the lower mandible can be very, very pale gray. And so if you're just looking and seeing some contrast here, you might think that you're looking at yellow-billed cuckoo, but it is in fact just that the juvenile birds can have a pale base to the lower mandible. And juvenile black-billed cuckoos are quite likely to be buffy on the underparts, which would be another clue that we could utilize. Juvenile yellow-billed cuckoos would be white. And so if we do get a buffy area here like that, that would be a clue that we're looking at black-billed cuckoo. And that buff extends from the throat down onto the upper breast as well. And once again, in my opinion, the best chance for positive ID is to be able to see that underside of the tail. And again, it's something that you can see in flight, so we definitely want to look for that. So it's important to remember that it's best to consider all the variables that we have to work with. That would be the bill, the eye orbital ring here, and the color in the flight feathers or the edges of the flight feathers, and that undertail pattern. Those are all features that we need to take a close look at. And they may not all be pointing into the same ID because there are some variables. In fact, in this particular black-billed cuckoo, as I mentioned, you can have a pale base to the lower mandible. So that is showing in this particular image. So that might throw you off. So because we had those other examples where orbital rings were not matching what they're supposed to look like, in this case, the black bill does have a red orbital ring. This yellow-billed cuckoo is lacking the yellow orbital ring. So it's going to be a trade-off. Some of the features are going to be pointed in the right direction, some will not. So we have to kind of give some weight to the various features that we're going to be looking at. And by far, I give the most weight to that underside of the tail. That should be most obvious. Even in this bird that's in profile here, you can still catch the fact that it has very bold spots in the underside of the tail. And this bird here obviously does have those little crescents. So I utilize the underside of the tail probably the most. And then the next amount of weight that I give to any feature would probably be that bill color. And then that would be followed by the orbital ring, and then that coloration in the wings, which at times can be very, very difficult to see. This bird here has some very good light on it in that region, and so you can see the Rufus showing quite well here. And you can see how it contrasts with the more brownish part of the rest of the wing. So there are trade-offs, and so we do have to just do our best in weighing those and deciding, which features should carry the most weight when we do have some conflicts. So thanks for taking the time to view this video, and hopefully I've given you some bird food for thought. And I hope you'll join us again in the future as we explore all things bird related.